Hi, Claire, and Kristian from Bulgaria. You're one of the few, I think, historians who actually presents Anne Boleyn's character in a favorable light, while most of them depict her as more or less a she-wolf, including David Starkey. In his book on the Six Wives, David Starkey literally says that she went after Thomas Wolsey, that she went after Catherine of Aragon, Thomas More, and all of them. To what extent would you say that this argument for the vicious version of Anne has merit? And does David Starkey have any realistic historical grounds to back this up? I love your work, Claire. Thanks so much.
Thank you to Kristian from Bulgaria for that excellent question regarding Anne Boleyn and Cardinal Wolsey. In his book on Henry VIII's Six Wives, historian David Starkey does give Anne Boleyn a lot of the credit for the fall of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor and Chief Advisor. And he notes that as Anne rose, Wolsey's power declined. He writes of how Wolsey had upset Anne in the past by failing to carry through her marriage with James Butler and then calling off her relationship with Henry Percy, and that he then let both her and the king down by his failure to get the king's first marriage, his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, annulled. Wolsey had been the king's faithful servant from the start of his reign, arranging diplomatic treaties and taking care of business while the young king got on with enjoying the more interesting perks of kingship. But he does seem to have underestimated the king's desire to marry Anne Boleyn. Wolsey actually had a couple of falls from favour before his final fall. In 1527, he was out of favour temporarily for not supporting the idea of Henry marrying Anne. Then, in 1529, after the hopes of the king and Anne were dashed by the failure of the legating court to rule on the annulment and its subsequent adjournment, Wolsey was vulnerable. Even King Francis I of France pointed out that for someone with such marvellous intelligence, with the Pope and in Rome, and also with the Cardinal Campeggio, that it was strange that the Pope and Legate were not doing what Henry wanted. Henry VIII became disillusioned with Wolsey, and things got worse for the Cardinal when, as Eric Ives points out, he miscalculated the king's mood and by mishandling the Treaty of Cambrai, in which Francis I totally deceived him and caused him, in turn, to mislead his master. However, although Wolsey was forced to resign the Great Seal in October 1529 and was charged with premunire, he was able to keep in contact with the king and was fully pardoned in early 1530. But it was then that he made his fatal mistake of working towards what Ives describes as a rapprochement with Catherine, Charles V and Rome, which, combined with Catherine's appeal to Rome, resulted in the Pope ordering the king to return to his first wife and to set Anne Boleyn aside. Both Anne and the king were furious, and the king eventually saw that Wolsey had to go. Wolsey was arrested in early November 1530 and was on his way to London to answer charges of treason when he contracted dysentery and died at Leicester Abbey on the 29th of November 1530. But what was Anne Boleyn's role in Wolsey's fall? Well, George Cavendish, Wolsey's gentleman usher, in his biography of his master, writes of how Anne vowed revenge on Wolsey after he broke up her relationship with Henry Percy. Cavendish writes that, wherewith Mistress Anne was greatly offended, saying that if it lay ever in her power, she would work the cardinal as much displeasure as she did indeed after. And he writes of how she was ordered back to the family home of Hever, whereat she smoked, i.e. sulked and stewed. It's a great story, and Cavendish was in Wolsey's household, so a contemporary source. But I have to agree with Eric Ives, who thinks that a threat from Anne at this time is very improbable. This was probably around 1522-1523, not long after Anne had returned to England from France, and she was just a maid of honour. Would she really have threatened Cardinal Wolsey, the king's chief adviser, like that? I seriously doubt it. Anne had no way of knowing that she'd ever be in a position to help bring down the cardinal, and Cavendish was writing this after Wolsey's fall, with the hindsight of knowing what happened. I'm sure Anne was heartbroken and angry with the Percy situation, but she wouldn't have threatened a powerful man. That would have been futile and stupid. Anne may not have threatened Wolsey back in the early 1520s, but Anne and her family certainly did play a role in Wolsey's fall from power. Anne had a good relationship with Wolsey when he appeared to be working for the annulment, sending him pleasant, friendly, almost gushing letters, such as the one she sent him when Campeggio had been ordered to come to England from Rome, when she wrote of being most bound of all creatures next to the King's grace to love and serve your grace, of the which I beseech you never to doubt that ever I shall vary from this thought as long as any breath is in my body. However, she did vary from that thought when it became clear that Wolsey was stalling at best and at worst working against her. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, Henry VIII's good friend, the Duke of Suffolk, and Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, were all eager for Wolsey to fall. He'd become too big for his boots after all, and they took advantage of the cardinal's mistakes and loss of favour, as was always the way at court. Wolsey had survived a few hiccups by keeping in touch with the king, but in 1530, Wolsey's enemies were able to keep him and the king apart, and the furious Anne, in the words of Eric Ives, whipped up the king's anger and brought out again her wasted youth and the reputation she'd risked for Henry, even threatening to leave him. Henry too was disillusioned with his previously faithful and effective servant, so it was an easy choice to make. He calmed his sweetheart by promising to get rid of Wolsey. Anne, her father, uncle, and the Duke of Suffolk played their parts, but they didn't cause the cardinal's fall. They just took advantage of the situation, his mistakes, and his loss of favour. Anne and Henry needed an advisor who was working for them, for the annulment, so that they could marry, and Wolsey had shown himself incapable of that. He needed replacing. I don't see his fall as an act of revenge by Anne for her earlier heartbreak. Wolsey just wasn't doing his master's bidding, and Anne felt she had no more time to waste. Wolsey's actions, which were contrary to the king's wishes, were ultimately responsible for his fall. I hope that has answered your question, Kristian. It was a really interesting question. And I would recommend the book, The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn by Eric Ives, which really goes into detail on this time period, the great matter and what Wolsey did for it. And of course, what happened with Anne and Henry. It's a fabulous book. Anyway, you can subscribe to this channel by clicking around about there. You can hit the bell to be notified as these videos go live, and you can give me a like and leave me a comment. I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.